Welcome back. Today we are at the last lecture, lecture 5 in this module, module 5, where we are looking at the word acquisition process among children. Now, till now we have covered a number of theories, a number of assumptions, and we have also looked at the various kinds of issues that children might face while they are acquiring words. So, for example, we have started with looking at how children's word acquisition starts as a very low pace. Then in the beginning it is a very slow process, and then they reach a stage of what is called naming explosion, when they learn about 9 words per day. So, starting with a very slow segmentation of the speech stream, eventually being able to speak in words, that takes up a little bit of time, but that reaches a very important juncture where we can call it a naming explosion. So, innate linguistic constraints explain the process with the hypothesis about how there are some innate linguistic biases in place that could handle this. For example, we looked at the whole word hypothesis, taxonomic assumption, and so on and so forth. So, there are various innate linguistic processes. So, that is about how the language acquisition in the word level is dependent on language related constraints. They were not talking about the any other kinds of process. So, that was one that we first looked at in terms of theory. Then we looked at the other kinds of theories. For example, there is another theory of innate learning mechanism, which is a general purpose learning mechanism. Now, this theory talked about how the general cognitive processes through which the child goes through in the developmental during the developmental stages, that takes care of the acquisition of words as well. So, there is no linguistic language specific innate constraints needed, but general purpose mechanisms can take care of language acquisition. And then there was another theory where we looked at the socio-pragmatic factors that says that socio-pragmatic factors can take care of the entire process. Neither we need much of a linguistic innate hypothesis, innate bias, nor we need the general purpose cognitive mechanism, but more of it in the social domain. So, children learn by looking at the others, the social cues that are present in any kind of a conversation scenario. That is what the child picks up, and eventually they learn to figure out how the novel word maps onto an object, and to which part of the object or the whole object or the part of the object, whatever is relevant, those cues are given by the environment, and that is what the child is smart enough to pick up. So, for each of these theories we have seen a lot of studies that have verified the hypothesis, also some theories that have not found the proof for this kind of a position. Last theory that we discussed was socio-pragmatic theory. If you recall, we looked at the widget experiment, where the experimental setup itself created two kinds of scenario, where one was the action oriented, the other was object oriented, and how the children performed. So, these were the 3 major domains of theoretical positions that we have already discussed. So, as a result of which, what we are looking at is when we talked about the linguistic constraints, we are talking about what is natural, what is there inbuilt, because when we are talking about anything that is universal, anything that is innate, we are going back to the nature-nurture hypothesis, and this is the stand that the nature part of the nature-nurture debate talks about. So, children are born with that capacity. Children are they already have those linguistic constraints in place, and because we are calling them universal, that means all children are born with that capacity. So, that is one part of it. On the other extreme, we have our socio-pragmatic factors, which talks about nurture. So, the learning happens in the environment. the socio-pragmatic cues, the social cues in turn, which means the environment, larger environment that plays a role rather than the linguistic constraints. So, this is the other side of the story where we talk about nurture. So, nature nurture debate has been going on, and that is what we have seen so far. Now, one of the important takeaway from these theories is that they take some sort of an either or position. So, either you need a linguistic constraint or you need socio-pragmatic cues are enough. That is what we mean by either or. So, it is not a combination of various things. On the one hand, we have universal bias, which is good enough as per the theory. On the other hand, the socio-pragmatic theory says that this is good enough. So, this is an either or. They are mutually exclusive, right. So, this is one kind of a position that these theories have taken. On the other hand, they also focus on specific issues, for example, like verb learning and then extension issues and so on. We have discussed at length about the extension issues, what are the factors, how overextension happens, how underextension happens, what are the possible parameters the children follow and so on. So, there are those specific language related issues, the word learning issues that these theories have addressed. They have not addressed all of them. That is why we could find that there are certain issues, there are certain criticisms with each of these theories, because a particular theory may not answer a particular concern and so on. So, on the one hand, they take either or position in terms of what is the process that they are addressing. On the other hand, which aspect of language learning is their primary concern. So, this is how they were mutually exclusive. Now, of late there is a recent development, there is a hybrid theory which is called the Emergentist coalition model. Now, this model seeks to find some sort of a middle ground. This theory, the primary premise of this theory is that the debate between nature and nurture can be solved if we take a middle ground. Now, the middle ground means that we do not completely discard any of the theories that have been there before, but we can take the best out of each sort of a understanding is what they are proposing. Now, this theory this came out in the year 2000. The Emergentist coalition model is basically, and I quote, sensitive to the multiple strategies children use to break the word barrier and to move from novice to expert learners. So, that is the gist of the entire theory. They say that till now we have seen each theory we are targeting one particular kind of a cue and that targets one particular kind of language learning process. This theory says that it takes a very different view. It says that the child has access to a number of strategies, multiple strategies, and that is what they use. They do not use only one strategy, they use a number of strategies in order to go from the novice learner to the expert speaker of the language. So, expert speaker, let us say they will be 2.5 to 3 years of age is when they figure out the meaning of words, nouns and verbs, and they can even speak in simple sentences. In some cases they even use complex sentences. So, to reach that stage from the speech segmentation stage, they actually need to use more than one strategy. That is what the primary idea of this theory is. Let us break it down to parts. So, the question they start out with is whether infants start out as an associative animal and then later understand the importance of social cues. So, while they have access to a number of cues, number of strategies, they do not use all of them at the same time. The idea is that in the beginning they use one set of strategies and in the middle they use another, and they eventually move on to different strategies from one to another. So, this theory proposes that children do take into consideration the social cues, but at a later stage. So, 12-month-olds avoided mismapping and were sensitive to, but did not recruit social cues as the 19-month to 24-month-old child did. So, this is from a particular study that they carried out, which we will discuss later. So, the idea is that social cues are also used. They also children similarly also use the universal bias as well. So, this theory positions itself theoretically speaking in the larger domain. How is the theory positioned? So, on the one hand you have the innateness hypothesis, we talked about this in the beginning of this course, where we talked about Chomsky's theory of how innateness hypothesis says that language learning is an innate capacity. We are born with we are bioprogrammed to learn language, that is one particular kind of a state. On the other hand, we have also looked at Vygotsky and Piaget and others who talked about how language acquisition is basically done through some sort of a constructivism, some sort of a construction process, where the child is an active member of that entire process. Child is not a passive absorber of information from the environment, nor are they pre-programmed to speak flawlessly and not doing anything on their own. So, in psychology there is something called radical middle that says that it is you do not need to take the extreme positions on the either this or that side. You can actually take a middle ground, and this theory also draws parallel to other emergentist models in developmental literature. So, this is not only in the domain of language learning, we are talking about ECM in the domain of language acquisition, but ECM positions itself in the radical middle understanding of psychology. The same psychology, same understanding has also been used in various other domains, particularly within the developmental literature, developmental processes of children, psychological development, mental development, cognitive development and so on. So, few of such studies, few such domains are the spatial development, number theory and language development of course. So, this is just to tell you give you an idea about where and how the theory is positioned. Now, there are three ideas that are central to this model. First, children are sensitive to multiple cues in word learning, which is attentional, social and linguistic cues. So, it is unlike the Markman's constraints, which are only linguistic cues, or you have the attentional cues or the socio-pragmatic. This theory says that children are sensitive to all the different kinds of cues that are in the environment. They can be linguistic, they can be social, they can be attentional and everything. Secondly, children weigh certain cues differently over others in the course of word learning. So, even though they start out with the accessibility to all the different kinds of cues in the environment, or they are born with those constraints, however, which cue or which constraint to use depends on the developmental stage they are in. So, as a result, each stage will be giving more weight to one of those cues or one of those constraints. So, not every cue is utilized to equal degree in each stage of word learning. That is what they mean. So, they weigh the cues differently depending on the stage of acquisition, and constraints on word learning develops from the process itself. So, what kind of constraint to be used depends on the processes, depends on the stage they are in and also the process. So, it may not be universal, for example. So, depending on a child and the language and the environment and the kind of categorization they follow and so on, they might need one cue before the other or one cue in a higher degree than the other and so on and so forth. Now, what is the most important aspect of this theory is that this by putting it in this way, that this theory gives a wide range of possibilities for children to utilize. It is not one size fits all, it is a plethora of choices that the child has, and depending on the child's developmental stage, he or she will utilize this or that kind of cue more. They will be utilizing all the cues, but depending on the situation they will use in a higher degree either cue 1 or cue 2. That is the idea. So, this is why this theory has found supporters across many domains. So, they explain this with the whole object constraint. This is something we have already discussed before. So, I am not explaining it again. Now, we will look at it from the ECM perspective. So, children have a bias to distinguish whole objects from the surroundings. Now, why do they have this? Because from their perspective, because it helps them identify objects from the surroundings. They need to identify discrete object. Now, this is not just a linguistic capacity, but it is also a cognitive capacity. It is also part of your visual spatial cognitive apparatus. If for example, the child when they are born, their visual system is not very well developed, it develops over a period of time. Now, one of the primary thing about visual cognition is that you need to understand the scene. From if you are given a scene, you need to be able to, the visual system need to be able to find out the discrete entities in the environment. So, in a classroom, when we are facing a classroom, for example, if we are not able to distinguish each of the chairs and each of the desks, then there is something problematic with our visual system. Typically, it does not happen. We generally go through these developmental stages smoothly. So, that is what this theory says, that a whole object constraint is not just a linguistic constraint, but it is also dependent on the developmental stages of the child, because they need to understand the discreteness of objects and differentiate it from, let us say, substances, right. So, that is the idea. So, this in turn will be helpful in learning language. So, this is not just one process, but it is a there is an interaction. This is a dynamic process between language and other cognitive developments. But there is a problem. This idea is not helpful in learning parts of the objects. We have found out that objects are discrete. From the scene we can find out one instance of the object, but how to go about when we are talking about parts of the same object. So, they grow up, when they grow up, they need to now use different cues to understand that aspect of the scene. For example, social cues may not be used in the beginning, but at a later stage by the time basic TOM is in place. I hope you remember TOM. We discussed theory of mind. TOM stands for theory of mind. Social cues, understanding social cues are dependent on joint attention. Joint attention and theory of mind go hand in hand. So, by the time before the theory of mind, at least the basic tenets of theory of mind is in place, they will not be able to make good use of the social cues. So, even if or even when social cues are there in the environment, they will not be able to utilize it properly. That is what the theory says. So, this theory is based on a dynamic model. This dynamic model is not just dependent on linguistics, but it has other domains also which has used it. I have given one example here, one reference here. So, that includes what does the dynamic model basically include? It includes multiple cues to arrive at a complex process. So, the underlying logic here is that to call this model a dynamic model, because it gives you different levels of cues. All the cues are around you, but you utilize them level wise, and there is a lot of interaction across them, across the levels, and that makes the entire language learning process a complex process. It is not a linear kind of a system. So, this is coming together of which components of which theory best describes children's word acquisition. So, the model's essential features, the three tenets of this model which that look at the developmental stages of the child's language learning. The focus is on the origins of word learning as well as the transformation that takes place in the second year of life when the child becomes an expert word learner. So, the starting at 12 months, typically the findings have been that is the time when they start to learn words. So, starting from that position, that is the origin, and till the second year of life, that is when they become expert learners. So, that is the time frame that this model addresses. And how do they address it? They have this kind of a hypothesis of stage wise developments. I have called it a growth hypothesis. Of course, the authors do not call it growth hypothesis. It is just that they provide you stages of development. So, how typically the children will start and what will follow what. So, in the first stage of learning words, that is 10 to 12 months, children will have access to multiple cues, attentional, social and linguistic. Thus, this is the novice stage. So, in the novice stage, perceptual salience would be more heavily weighted than the social cues. This is the stage when they are novice. 10 to 12 months, they are beginning to speak in words, they are beginning to understand words. So, at that stage perceptual cues will be most favored, let us say, that will be what the children will depend more on. So, this is the first stage, right. So, perceptual salience, as in looking at a bright object as the most important object in the environment, that is what we mean by the perceptual salience or attending to perceptual cues. So, word learning principles would develop along a continuum from immature to mature. So, in the most immature state, this will be the perceptual, and as they grow up, as they mature into an expert learner as per this theory in the second year of life, that is when they will eventually go to others. So, thus they start with what is perceptually salient, and only later they figure out what is actually important, which is easily understandable, because in the when they are very small, they have not gotten the whole understanding of the environment or what is important, then whatever is salient in the environment will catch their attention, that is what they will focus on. So, at an even later stage, they will be guided by associationist laws. Remember our how children are expected to learn through association. So, they hear a word and they see an object, and when these two things co-occur across scenarios, across context, they get to map it. So, that associationist views will be, or laws will be attended to at a later stage. And finally, when they mature into veteran, these are their words, veteran word learners, they are guided, though not completely, by social pragmatic strategies. So, starting from perceptual cues to associations to social pragmatic cues is how the journey goes. So, that is why I have called this the growth hypothesis. So, there are many studies, the authors themselves have provided some experiments where they show this. So, the evidence is already provided. So, how it goes? One study I have added here. So, the children were from the age of 10 months to 24 months. The task was to check if children attach a novel word to a boring toy or an interesting toy. So, because we are dealing with children, the experiments, even though the underlying question was whether perceptual cues are more salient for children and at what age, that was the main question. So, the perceptual cue, for example, how they manipulated perceptual cue was creating an interesting toy and a boring toy. So, there were two kinds of toys that were used. So, the boring toy was a dull beige color with no moving part. The interesting toy was brightly colored with moving parts. Method they used was preferential looking paradigm, which I have discussed before. So, the experiment went like this. There were two phases. By now, you are already familiar with the phases. There will be a training phase and there will be a test phase. Training phase, they had children saw both the toys. They were attached to a blackboard with velcro. So, there was one dull toy, one interesting looking toy, and the experimenter looked at one of the toys and gave it a novel name, and this activity was carried out 5 times. The novel name was Danu. This word did not exist, does not exist, it is a novel word and the children had not heard it before. So, the scenario is like this. So, the two toys are present simultaneously, the experimenter gives one of them a name. In the test phase, children were shown the toys again. Now the experimenter is not there in the environment, she is hiding behind the blackboard, and they ask the child, where is Danu? Now, the child has to do either pick up one or the other, either boring or the interesting toy. That is what was the dependent. DV is dependent variable. So, what is it? That is our result. The result is where the child will look, because this is preferential looking paradigm that they used. Now, there were another very interesting manipulation in this experiment, that is called the conditions. They used two different conditions that were part of the that was embedded in the design. One is called the coincident condition and the other is conflict condition. Coincident condition is when the interesting toy was labeled. So, in the training phase, we said that the experimenter named a toy. So, in some cases she named the interesting toy, in some cases she named the boring toy. So, that is our that is how the conditions were created. So, the coincident condition is when the interesting toy was labeled. So, thus perceptual cue and the social cues are in sync. What does it mean? Perceptual cue is the boring toy is obviously perceptually low in salience, and the interesting toy is perceptually of higher salience. So, in this case, by labeling the interesting toy, they were connecting both perceptual cue and the social cue in the same object, which is the interesting toy. In the conflict condition, the boring toy was labeled. Now, the interesting toy is obviously the higher of a higher perceptual salience, but the name was given to the boring toy. So, naming the naming activity is the social cue, but the appearance of the toy is the perceptual cue. So, social cue and perceptual cue in this particular case in the conflict condition are mismatched, they are not matching. So, these were the conditions that were created. What did they find? Quite interesting finding. So, at 24 months old children successfully ignored the perceptual cue and focused on the social cue. What does it mean? It means that for the 24-month-old children, most of the cases they could correctly identify the boring toy. That means, remember our target condition is the conflict condition. The coincidental condition was basically a kind of a control condition. So, the actual main part of the experiment was the conflict condition. So, in the conflict conditions, most of the times 24-month-old children successfully ignored the perceptual cue, meaning they did not look so much to the brightly colored toy, but they looked at the boring toy, because that was the toy that was mentioned, that was the toy that was labeled by the experimenter. So, if she is asking for that, then they will be looking at it. Slightly younger children at 19 months were also successful, but had more tendency towards perceptual cues compared to the 24-month-old children. And then 12-month-olds failed to identify the boring object. However, this is a very interesting phase of life apparently, because the 12-month-old children could not find the boring object. So, when they were faced with the conflict condition, they could not identify, meaning they did not look at the boring object long enough to give us the indication that they understood. However, they also did not label the interesting toy, which was taken as a proof that probably they were aware of the social cues, but did not know how to use it yet. So, they were in a cusp, in a very interesting position, interesting stage in the developmental trajectory. 10-month-old children looked longer at the interesting toy, irrespective of what the experimenter focused on. So, meaning that 10-month-old children completely ignored the social cues and focused entirely on the perceptual cue. So, you can see the entire trajectory, 10-month-old focusing primarily on the interesting toy, irrespective of the command or the social cues. 24-month-old children could ignore the perceptual cue and focus on the social cue. So, this is taken as a proof of the ECM theory, because they said in the initial stages of life there will be children will focus more on perceptual cue. As they grow up, they will be able to take social cues into consideration, and this is part of their growing up, part of their maturational stages. There are of course, even though this theory has been taken pretty well, but there are very less criticism, but still there are. So, one of the criticism is that why do we need too many mechanisms to be in place when one theory could take care of all the problems. This criticism has primarily come from the socio-pragmatic theory group. For example, Akhtar and Tomasello in another paper, they said that socio-pragmatic mechanism is good enough to tackle all the issues that we are talking about. So, rather than having 3-4 stages, why do not we just look at one theory? That is one of the one of the criticisms. However, they do acknowledge that there might be a few more processes, but they are ancillary, they are not important, they are not core. ECM makes everything core. So, universal bias is also taken as a core mechanism of the entire process, which is relevant in the beginning, in the first stage. So, 10-month old children will be showing that kind of a thing, that kind of a tendency, and eventually others. But the socio-pragmatic theory group says that these other things are ancillary, they are not part of the core mechanism. The other kind of criticism that this theory has faced is with respect to the universal bias. So, remember when we talked about universal bias, we looked at that how certain basic categories are also understood differently across the world's languages. Not every concept is categorized as the same concept. So, categorization is a fundamental mental process. So, if languages can differ there, then the universal bias probably does not hold. So, the same idea has been applied to this theory as well, that universality is not beyond question, especially because languages differ in some fundamental aspects like categorization. For example, in one such papers that has been they have described how in a particular language there are 3 different words for the concept of eating. So, in English the word eat, whatever it refers to as eat, can be broken down to 3 different categories in this particular language. For example, ingesting crunchy food like carrots, there is one word. Another word for food that are less crunchy but solid food like bananas, and then only for tortillas or other bread like food they have a third kind of a word. Now, which means they have 3 different categories of ingesting food, eating. So, eating can be broken down, and we are not even considering the liquid and the other kinds. So, it is only about ingesting, which is typically the core domain of what we call eating. So, that is how we can question the universal bias. So, these categories are probably not good candidate for universal bias. Researchers like Bloom, for example, proposes that based on this kind of evidence, that there are certain languages which do not seem to obey the universal bias very well. Because of this, maybe ECM does not even need the universal bias. So, rest of the features of ECM are fine, they have not been criticized a lot, but universal bias probably is not needed. So, there are some studies based on that, and they have shown that maybe it can be gotten rid of. So, to sum up in this module, what we have learned, in this module we have discussed how children go from segmenting speech stream into phonological word forms to acquiring lexical entities. So, starting from the speech segmentation to acquiring words, by words we mean word forms with meaning. So, that is what becomes the actual word. And then we explained the possible issues children may face while forming their understanding of meaningful words. Then theories based on constraints, general purpose cognitive mechanism, socio-pragmatic factors have also been discussed. And finally, today we discussed a model that attempts to arrive at some kind of a middle ground by incorporating essential aspects of the previous theories and proposes a dynamic model in their place. So, with that we complete this module which focused on word acquisition. Thank you.